Hi there, friends. We just want to chat to you today about an amazing topic. Tohu Wa-Bohu is the way in which Genesis 1 refers to chaos. Now, the theme of chaos runs throughout the scriptures, and it has a radical, new and promising way of how Elohim can deal with chaos. Yeah,
and we've got a special guest with us, Tanya Stanfield. We're so happy to have you join our conversation. And
hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, Tanya and Kevin have been precious friends of ours, and they're two beautiful children. They live in Muizenberg and are part of a YWAM base there. Tanya actually joined us in our Mimesis Academy and then progressed to actually teaching it as part of the master's program, I think, as far as I know, that you do at YWAM. And yeah, she holds a master's degree in Christian spiritual formation and discipleship. She's authored a book on human trafficking. So we're really privileged to have your conversation, Tanya. We really appreciate your insights.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. This is fun.
And so just before we start, friends, if you enjoy these conversations, why don't you subscribe to the channel, share it with some friends, and then you'll be notified of any new material that comes out. So Genesis 1, wow, how relevant it is today, because I think we, on a worldwide basis, have experienced our normal activities and our normal order being put on pause. And it feels like there's a little bit of chaos brewing at this stage. At least for the most part, it is contained. For most of us, it's just a small inconvenience. But I do appreciate that for some people, this is real chaos already. Many people have lost their sources of income, their jobs. Friends of ours, whose family have family who have lost their lives to this virus. So for some, the chaos is much more real than for others. And I think we have a unique opportunity at this moment to understand the kind of environment and situations that people were in when they wrote their origin stories. The reason that chaos is so prominent even at the beginning of Genesis 1 is because that was a genre of writing that existed even before the Genesis stories. There were many origin myths, and they always began with chaos. And this chaos wasn't just some theoretical, philosophical idea. It was real communities in crisis where their normal order came to be totally broken down, and the new order was created that gave birth to these stories. And so I just want us to explore a bit about what is it about Genesis that is so hopeful.
And how God deals with chaos.
How God deals with chaos, which is very different. Yeah. I'll invite you, Tanya, if you've got some thoughts to share there as well.
Yeah. Well, maybe you should explain what that fabulous word was that you started with. Tohu
Wa-Bohu. And that's that's such an interesting word. So the text begins, when God began creating, the earth was Tohu Wa-Bohu, which you can translate it welter or waste. Some translate it as chaotic and formless. And that word, the other places it is used within Genesis, speaks about the area outside of our community that is still wild, that is still wasteland, that is not under control. It's often used of the sea because the sea was untamed and it's formless. And I find it fascinating that creation begins before God speaks a word of anything creative. It begins with this idea that at the very start of God beginning to create, there's chaos. That alone, I think, is quite fascinating for where we find ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. And in comparison to other origin myths, the chaos in those myths, like the Enuma Elish with Tiamat and Marduk, is a war of the gods, and there's bloodshed, and there's murder, and there's demon monster gods springing up. That's the kind of chaos. And the chaos that we see in our Genesis story is something, what did you say, Marianne? It was a contemplative hovering.
Yes,
the
spirit. The Spirit of God hovering over the wasteland.
Yeah.
Yeah, the beauty of that right there, of how God handles chaos, that from it God creates. It's like chaos is the paints, the materials upon which he paints his his wonder, which he brings forth us, in his image. It's quite so different the way that chaos is handled in Scripture.
Such an invitation, in that contemplative silence, that hovering, there's an invitation to call forth beauty. And there's this hint that there's light within that darkness. There's beauty within this waste place. And I think that's so beautiful, because we can catch that strong hint that there is this invitation. God is inviting beauty, and we can reflect the same. We can invite beauty out of these situations.
And I think to see the
kind of
beauty,
like with I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
I was going to say, it's kind of like we could co-create with God, like, because we're in his image, we're co-creators, but what are we going to create from the chaos is the question.
Yes.
I wanted to maybe emphasize the contrast between the Genesis origin story and the other origin myths that were around even before Genesis. And I'll try to do it as concisely and shortly as possible. But I think the contrast provides us with new meaning and new beauty as well. René Girard, the intellectual who helped us understand many of these origin myths, looked at the prominence of chaos at the beginning of all these stories. And he identified it as a real crisis within a community. And that's something that, as a world community, we can identify with now more than ever before. If you imagine the bit of chaos we have now, without the strong rule of law as we have, without the wonderful technology and supplies that we have now, the kind of fear and anxiety that it would have created within ancient communities often boiled over into violence. And violence by its very nature escalated. And so to fast forward this process, very quickly communities would go from just the panic that we experience now to a real fear, to real violence in a war of all against all. And then all across the world, it seems like a new solution presented itself. And that is, instead of everyone killing everyone, let's divert everyone's focus onto a single victim or a minority group, a scapegoat. And so the practice of sacrifice or sacred violence, a new kind of violence that saves the community from unrestrained violence, was born. And that it is out of those situations where the survivors would write a story about a monster of chaos that was going to consume our community, but a creative act of violence gave birth to a new civilization. That is basically the events that lies behind many of the origin myths. And it's in the light of that that the biblical text is so profoundly beautiful. Because this person imagines a God whose relationship to chaos is not chaos is the enemy, and violence and force will restore the established order. But rather it is, as you've expressed, a God who just silently hovers over this depth. And interesting there, what we've translated the face of the deep, the face of Temut in the Hebrew, is the equivalent of Tiamut in the Enuma Elish myth. So even there's a word play that people would have understood, that this God doesn't come to tear this monster of chaos apart, but to just hover over it in contemplative silence and start whispering and drawing this chaos into a new order, into new beauty, whispering and saying, let light separate from darkness. He actually saw light in the midst of that darkness. And I think that contrast between Genesis and the other origin myths is an opportunity to see as well how we can react to chaos differently today.
I think it's also fascinating that they actually use the biblical text. They use the areas around them, their communities, the cultures around them. They use the stories and what's happening around them to then influence the text they're writing. But at every point that they need to, they subvert it and bring out the richness and the beauty of this God who does create completely differently. So I find that so fascinating, you know?
Yes, I find that fascinating too. And it just brings me to, to today, that, God didn't have to resort to violence to handle chaos. Chaos is not God's enemy, but something from which he has a relationship with and creates from. And how, even today I'm watching what's happening around the world, and the choices people are making to do with their chaos. Are we hoarding toilet paper like they are in the United States and worrying about that, or blaming certain political parties, or blaming countries, that the virus came from you, already the scapegoating. Or do we create from chaos like our Father created from chaos? Are we his image bearers? Do we emulate him? Because we have a choice to make as Jesus followers.
Wow, that is something beautiful in Genesis 1 as well. There's no explanation where the chaos comes from. There's no scapegoating. There's no, this chaos comes from Mars. What are you doing on Earth? It's none of that blaming. God just begins with the chaos that's there. Reminds me of John 9, where the disciple sees the man born blind, and they ask, was it his sin or his parents' sin? Now, who caused this? There must be someone to blame. There must be a reason for this being here. And Jesus basically just says, you've got the wrong line of inquiry. If you want to get involved in the work of God, let's get involved in healing this man instead of finding who to blame for his sickness. Let's just get involved in the healing. And so that's beautiful in Genesis 1 as well. There's no attempt to explain the chaos or to assign blame or find its origin. It's just there. And God gets involved with healing, with bringing out new possibilities, bringing out new beauty out of what is there.
Which is a challenge to us, how we handle the chaos. And, do we...
And I've been thinking about... sorry, did I interrupt you, Marianne? Do you want to say something?
Carry on.
Okay. I was thinking about how in Ignatian spirituality, a big part of what St. Ignatius wanted us to do was to pay attention, that we can find God in everything. And Paula Darcy, she says, God comes disguised as your life. And right now, this chaos is this thing, this coronavirus is the thing the entire world is paying attention to. It's in all of our lives. It's affected all of our lives. And it's not that God caused it, but there's something that we're supposed to be paying attention to. He's speaking to the whole entire world with our focus on the same thing. And I just think about how all of us right now are thinking about what's most important, the people we love, taking care of ourselves, taking care of the most vulnerable. We're all paying attention to those things. And I think it was Dallas Willard who said the enemy of the soul is hurriedness, noise, and crowds. I think. And we are all slowing down. We are all pulling away to have this time where we actually, as a global community, have time to reflect.
It's almost like
to pay attention.
Unplanned Sabbath for our whole earth. Because if there's some unintended consequences, and one of the things that we could pay attention to is that all of creation being sustained by God, being kept in existence by Him, has for the first time in a long time had a bit of a breather. Even if you look at the pollution maps, my goodness, people who haven't seen blue skies in years because of the pollution in their cities can suddenly see the blue skies again. So there's definitely some positive things that we need to contemplate in terms of, is life only about consuming no matter what the cost? Is it about running around and just trying to enrich yourself no matter what the consequences? Or are we going to be forced more and more in the future to consider the consequences, of how we live? But this theme of chaos then, it runs throughout the scripture. I love, there's a beautiful piece within the Psalms as well. I think it's Psalms 104, where it speaks about God playing with Leviathan or sporting with him. Leviathan is one of the biblical images for this sea monster of chaos. And again, God is playing with the chaos. He's not just out hunting it, wanting to destroy it. There's actually a part of the chaos that has the potential for new beauty and for playfulness. I think it's one of the mystical Jewish writings, divided each day into three. The first third of the day, God was busy with this. The second third, he was busy with the Torah. But 1/3 of his day was busy playing with Leviathan, busy negotiating this chaos, and it was really a source of new creative possibilities. But then even into the New Testament.
Yeah. I think even of Jesus' attitude towards chaos and just the way he lives, and how just the example of being on the boat with the disciples in a storm. And the place where he's at is in this peaceful rest. And the storm is raging, it's there, they're all on the boat, they're in the same circumstances, which I think we all are, and the storm is raging and he sleeps. And I think what we often tend to do at the very appearance of chaos is fear kicks in, and a lot of our even spiritual warfare or our prayer life becomes more of a fearful standing on the word than what it is, God's attitude to this. There is potential in here. This is not for you to fear, but your position, again, as you mentioned, is pay attention. And how do you pay attention? We've all had this opportunity now to physically be indoors. Jesus, go into your inner room, close the door, and be with your Father. And there is a point, it's not that we just kind of retract everything, put our heads in the sand like ostriches. There's a point where Jesus stands up and he addresses the chaos, he addresses the storm, but it's not out of fear and trying to manipulate, but it's rather out of the peace that is flowing within him. He speaks peace. And you can only bring to the chaos and bring to the storm what you have.
Isn't that beautiful how that correlates to Genesis 1, verse 1 and 2? Hovering over the face of the deep.
Yes.
Jesus sleeping in the midst of the storm. That our first and foremost, our approach to chaos should be accessing this peace. Going back to the one who can create out of this situation instead of simply react, instead of simply fearing. Access that peace. Enter that silent hovering. Listen, pay attention. Because as we pay attention to the one who loves us and adores us, there's no fear in love. It's out of that place of intimacy that we'll be able to act with initiative, to speak in kindness instead of just out of the frustration.
And I think it is fascinating that, we often think of rest as inactivity, but the rest of God, we call, the only striving to enter that's spoken about in the New Testament is to enter his rest. And again, that rest is a place of paying attention. It's intertwining ourselves. And then it's fascinating how later on in that passage he speaks about it's the word that's alive and active. And so the greatest activity is fostered in a place of rest, where you then allow this word, you allow what you're seeing in this moment to become the greatest activity and the greatest authority and what have you in your life. So
and of course that word is Jesus. As in he is the word. And that passage that you were talking about on the storm has actually meant a lot to me, because Jesus said to his disciples, "Where is your faith?" And one time when I was doing an imaginative reading of that passage, I pictured Jesus asking me, "Where is your faith?" And I realized, oh, wow. I picture Jesus like a movie star. He's like tall, you know, he's got chiseled cheekbones. He's got like long flowing hair, you know, and but really, you know, in real life, Jesus would have been about 5 feet tall. He would have been about 2 inches shorter than me, because that's how large men of that time were generally.
Wow, that's
and but I felt safe with movie star Jesus. And God was saying to me, where is your faith? And I'm like, but I want a God of certain outcomes. I want to know everything in this life is going to turn out okay. Yeah. And I want a Jesus who's going to give me that. And God was just speaking to me, but
yes.
But the true Jesus was the human Jesus who was getting battered by the storm, who was soaking wet, whose hair was, you know, dripping. And that is the Jesus that will actually give you peace that surpasses understanding, not this false God of certainty.
Yeah.
But a knowing that is deeper than knowing what's going to happen.
Yeah.
You know, it's a knowing of him and an intimate, relational, restful knowing in Jesus. And that's such an invitation, I think, to me personally right now, and to the whole world of, where is your faith?
Yeah.
Is it in a God that actually creates out of chaos? Or are you saying, no, I'll only believe in a God that's going to order this chaos and keep toilet paper in my in my house,
or prevent it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Sure, that is stunning, Tanya.
Yeah. Wow. What the amazing opportunity we then have, and what the amazing responsibility that God is not that kind of God of certainty, the one who just comes and enforces his will upon a situation, but the God who invites us to join him in creating the meaning and the beauty of what's going to happen. And so the outcome of the pandemic we are in now is not just something that God says, don't worry, I'm in control, but rather God that says whatever's going to happen is going to happen through you. Let us do this together. Let us decide together. Beautiful little sparrow just came and sat here in the door. It's what caught my eye. But the God who so involves us in this process and in the outcomes of what happens. So
just thought of that sparrow, as you said. What a beautiful place to kind of conclude as well, with Jesus going, you know, look at the birds, look at the sparrow, not toiling and spinning, but simply resting, you know, and they're not storing up or gathering toilet paper for the next day, but simply resting in the provision of their Abba. And there's a silent knowing that I'm loved.
Yes.
And it's okay.
Yeah.
And for me, I think it's that space that you're talking about, that quiet, restful space where all of my creativity actually comes from. I'm not reacting. I'm stepping back from the fear. I'm stepping back from the what ifs, resting in this quiet space. And for some reason, that's where the Spirit meets me and creativity from there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Tanya. We should do this more often.
Yeah,
it's been pretty fun.
Love conversations with you.
Yeah, you with both of you too as well. I appreciate it. Appreciate you guys so much.
I think the two of you should do one on the Enneagram one of these days.
Yeah, we might the space.
At least
I don't know. I think
Tanya is giggling nervously.
Oh my God, I'm thinking, oh yeah, and then Penny's going to see it and we're all going to be in trouble. I'm like terrified to document anything about what I think of the Enneagram at this point.
We might have a casual conversation in that area.
About
other people, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you, Tanya, and our love to Kevin.
Yes.